Alright, so just before I continue on talking about tests, there is one little problem that I noticed, which may, depending on the device you choose, show up for you as well. When we actually run this, and I've actually uninstalled the app, so I'm installing a new version of it, so we can get the permissions dialog box to pop up. Okay, so I'm going to deny it, and I'm going to click on here. Now this message here doesn't actually fit. This app can't display your contacts records unless you, and it's supposed to say grant access, which is the string that we use there. So given that that actually says grant access, we can probably reduce this or reduce the size of the string there. So we can put unless you, I'm going to put 3 dots, which implies to get them to actually read the other side. So now if I run that and deny, unless you, and then it'll come over here to grant access. So it actually reads collectively as what we wanted them to say, and it actually fits a little bit better. Alright, so there's that. Now, what I want to do is talk about tests. Now, we've obviously been through testing the app under various scenarios, but there are actually a few more tests we should run. And it's a good idea to create a test script to make sure you cover all the possible situations, particularly if you end up putting your app in the App Store. Now the script doesn't have to be very complicated, but it should actually include the starting condition and the expected outcome. So for testing that we've got the permissions working correctly, I'm going to swing over to a slide and show you what a potential script might look like. So here's an example of a test script. So we've got the starting condition, if the app's not installed, the action, as well as the expected outcome. So I'm not going to actually read them all out, but you can actually just pause the video if you like, and you can sort of see the various states there. This is really what you should be doing as a tester and creating a test script for your application, so that anytime you make a change, you can confirm that it's still working the way you think it should be working. So that's the first page, but continuing on, we've got the other conditions to test as well, really, because it was quite a complicated process to go through and click on the various buttons, clicking on back and then tapping permissions and granting access and so on. So it's not something that you can probably necessarily remember, so it's a good idea to really write this down where possible. Then the last slide, again, is if the app's not installed, and the relevant action and the expected outcome. So that's a sample test script. At the moment, the script doesn't test allowing access when the app's first run, so that should also be included. And it also doesn't include testing on an Android version before API 23, so I'm going to give you a challenge here. And your challenge is to add those 2 tests to the script, then run them to make sure that everything works. And there's also another test that we haven't included, so have a think about that, about what that is, and add that to the script as well. So pause the video now and see if you can figure that out, and come up with a testing scenario for adding those 2 tests, and also another test that we haven't included. And when you're ready to come back and see what they are, start the video again. So pause the video now, and I'll see you when you get back. Okay, welcome back. Let's have a look at the challenge solution. So I've got a number of items here, and I'll put them in red. And the ones in red are the additional tests making sure that the app still behaves correctly after the user revokes permissions that had previously been granted. So we've got the revoking the permissions in settings, then we run the app. So at that point, obviously the permissions dialog should appear because we've revoked the permissions, we grant access, back to the app main screen, no contact showing, type FOB, then, or tap I should say, the floating action button, then the contact should show. Alright, so let's go back to the code. Alright, so let's have a final look at this code now before we leave permissions and get back to databases. So the first thing I'd now change is, now that we've removed the read underscore contacts underscore granted field, is in the onCreate method. So let's just go back up to that. Now the condition there has an if and an else part, as you can see. But the only thing we're actually doing if the condition's true is logging. So it's useful to log the fact that we're requesting permission, but it's not really necessary to log that permission was already granted. We'd know that if the requesting permission entry doesn't appear in the logcat. So we can actually simplify this code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out the existing code and put the simplified version below it. So I'm going to come over here to this first if on line 49 and comment that out up to and including lines 55. So comment the lot out And to the replacement code now is going to be if has read contact permission is not equal to package manager dot permission granted. Then we're going to do a log first, and it's going to be requesting permissions. And then we're going to do activity compat dot request permissions, and it's going to be this new string array, and the permissions read underscore contacts, and then we want to request underscore code underscore read contacts. So that's actually it. So it's obviously a lot simpler now. And notice also I changed the condition from what was an equals to a not equals there on line 56. And we're calling the request permissions if we didn't get permissions or permission underscore granted back from the package manager. The next thing we now need to change is in the on request permissions result method. And if we go down to have a look at that, so on request permissions result, as you can see on the screen there now. So now that we've made these other changes, it's not actually doing anything other than logging. Now, this callback method can be very useful, and we've used it earlier to disable the floating action button if we didn't have access to the contacts. So you'll still want to use it sometimes, but here, given the functionality that we've changed in other parts of the program, we don't actually need this anymore. Now, as you create more complex apps that might have secondary functionality, you might well find uses for this on request permissions result method, and now you know how to use it if you do need to do so. One thing you may want to do though is if there's provide a more descriptive dialogue explaining why the app needs a permission that's been denied and explaining what the app won't be able to do without the access. Often though, you're really not interested in knowing if permission was granted or not. You write the code to cope with both conditions, so there's really no point creating the on request permissions result method just for the sake of it. So given what I've said there, I'm going to actually comment out this entire method. So I'm just going to come down and comment the lot out. And of course, this is a callback method. It's not actually called directly from our program. It's called by Android as a callback, in case you're wondering why the code hasn't flagged any errors with us commenting that out completely. All right, so at this point, that's really the end of the discussion on the new permissions model introduced in Android Marshmallow, and we've covered quite a bit here. So hopefully when you're reading through the documentation, it'll actually make sense now, and this is the documentation that we've been to a few times now. I'll just put that back on the screen one more time. So we've been to this page a few times now, so hopefully now reading through that it makes a lot more sense now that you've actually seen how to put this permission into a sort of a real life app. So the new permission system is very flexible, at least for the users, and doesn't really create much extra work for us as developers. Most of the time you'll probably just copy the code from this app or from the Google documentation and use slightly modified versions of that to fulfill any specific criteria that differs for your particular app. You know, if you do want to do something a bit more complex, you should now really have all you need to be able to do so from a permissions point of view anyway. Now, I haven't covered how to show dialogues yet, but we'll be doing that in a later video in the course. But for now though, on with databases. So far in this section, we've looked at databases and then we saw how to perform basic database operations using the SQL language and SQLite. We then experimented with content providers and we saw how they are used to provide shared access to a data source. And you may recall we also used cursors to loop through the data from a data source. In the remainder of this section now, what we're going to do is create a full app that uses a SQLite database. Now we're going to access that data via a content provider, so we'll be seeing how to create and register our own content provider to allow the data to be shared. So let's get started on that in the next video.